to this afternoon presentation, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the Green Crescent, and all the other institutions who are involved in this. It's been a great job you've been doing, and these have been very fruitful days. Thank you very much. It's late in the afternoon, and we are tired and we are late, so I'll try to be a bit strict on the timetable here, and I will not do too much talking right now. I suggest that we start as soon as we can. And our first speaker this session is Faye Watson. You are the Secretary General of EURAD, Europe Against Drugs, and you will talk on this topic of drug policies and human rights, and the floor is yours.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, members of Turkish Green Crescent, thank you very much for your time today. As we're running a little bit late, I will try to be as brief as possible. To give a little bit of explanation as to why we do this presentation today on human rights, this work has been produced by an ex-UN worker from human rights who worked in human rights for 12 years. So I'm actually presenting this on her behalf today. And I'm presenting from our network EURAD, of which I'm the Secretary General, which is Europe Against Drugs, soon to be Europe for Action on Drugs. And we are a drug demand reduction NGO network based in Brussels. And we are very pleased to announce that Turkish Green Crescent recently joined our network, and we're very glad to have them on board. They are the first member organization that we have from Turkey. So EURAD, we mainly advocate for drug policies which are focused around prevention and recovery. So we have many NGOs on the ground at grassroots level, such as San Patrignano. You may have heard their presentation earlier today, and also Celebrate Recovery, who presented yesterday. We're also members of the EU Civil Society Forum on Drugs, and I'm the vice chair of that group. And we're an ECOSOC registered NGO. And we are one of the only we are the only drug policy network based in Brussels. So we have quite good connection to European institutions, for example. So today I will do a background about the various human rights frameworks, how human rights applies to various elements of drug policy, examples of how human rights laws can be violated, and we finish with some recommendations. So when we talk about human rights, very often what we're talking about are the various international covenants on human rights, as well as the various treaties which countries can choose to opt into. So, for example, there's different treaties, for example, for migrant workers, for example. And this is a map of how many treaties on human rights the different countries have actually ratified. So for your interest, Turkey have actually ratified 16 human rights treaties, compared to, for example, the UK, they have signed 13, Belgium have signed 17, and sort of at the lower end of the scale, the USA, who have ratified 9, Iran, who have ratified 7, and China, who have ratified 9. But when we talk about how drug policy relates to human rights, drugs is actually only mentioned in really one human rights convention, that's the rights of the child in Article 33. Apart from, of course, the UN drug control conventions themselves. In the drug control conventions, they don't actually encourage states, and this is a very important thing to mention, is that the drug conventions do not encourage states to take measures that would violate human rights. A blanket sort of incarceration of drug users is also not encouraged under the international drug conventions by UNODC or by the INCB. But the conventions do talk about sanctions, but it clearly states that these sanctions could also equate to drug treatment. So some people blame, or like to blame, the drug control conventions for breaches in human rights. But what we want to show you today is, on a legal standpoint, what sort of violations there may be in drug policy, and whose responsibility they are. So I'm now going to go through a short list of different types of human rights which could apply quite closely to drug policy. The first one is the rights of children. So in all actions concerning children, the best interests of the child should always have the primary consideration. So for example, if the child has infringed a penal law, they should be treated in a manner that's consistent with the promotion of the child's sense of dignity and their reintegration into society. So potential violations, you could argue, could be like a lack of drug services for children who have drug problems. And you may think that this is only in sort of undeveloped countries where you don't have drug services for children. But for example, even in the UK, for the most marginalized drug users who may have very fragmented lives, may find themselves on the streets, there is actually no residential treatment for children at all under the age of 18. Other clear points of human rights violations would be, obviously, the death penalty should not be applied to children under any circumstance. And also, you have some human rights violations in regard to how children are incarcerated. The second right, which I'll talk about, is the right to life. The death penalty is prohibited in countries where the optional protocol to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights has been ratified and is not allowed to be used on children in any country. For countries which have not abolished the death penalty, the sentence of death may only be imposed for the most serious crimes. The drug offences do not meet this threshold. So an area where you could have human rights action would be where you do see that the death penalty is being used for drug offences. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch often document these quite graphically. And this is one of the images that they use to show where the death penalty is being used in various countries. From this diagram, you can see that we have the USA on one side and China on the other. But we also have been seeing in the last few years some kind of worrying developments in countries like Iran. So in 2013, 687 people were executed through the use of the death penalty, which was a 16% increase on 2012 in 1 year. And possession and trafficking of narcotics remain a common charge amongst those people. For example, there are other countries where we have issues with the death penalty, in countries where the death penalty is not allowed. So for example, even in the UK, you may have people who have been convicted of drug trafficking offences who are in a country where the death penalty still exists. So for example, there is a case at the moment where there is a lady called Lindsay Standiford who was found guilty of drug trafficking offences in Indonesia, and she lost her appeal, and at the moment it is very unclear of how she can actually follow through on another court case because she is not receiving any financial support to evade the death penalty. So there are also cases of extradition where the death penalty does not exist. The third right that we'll talk about is the right to healthcare and to treatment. And this is in Article 12 of the International Covenant of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. It requires states to recognize the right to health for all people. The right to health contains freedoms and entitlements, including the right to be free from non-consensual medical treatment and to be free from torture. Forced labour, solitary confinement, and treatment administered without consent may violate human rights laws. And for one example of potential violations could be, for example, Human Rights Watch claimed that in Ukraine, drug users were actually facing arrest when they were going to drug treatment services. So this is one way where maybe you could argue that their human rights to healthcare was being clearly impeded by an enforcement approach. The fourth right, which is clearly linked to drug policy, is the right to non-discrimination. And the principle of this is that all people should be equal in front of the law. And so there are two types of discrimination from a legal basis. There's direct discrimination, where there is less favourable treatment on bases such as race, gender, disability. And then there's indirect discrimination, where a practice is neutral or appears to be neutral, but it impacts disproportionately on some people. So, for example, violations could be mandatory HIV testing, where it is not required, or the misuse of stop and search powers. So stop and search is a thing that's often used in the UK. The police can stop anyone and search them for possession of drugs. And this is very hard to say whether people are actually being discriminated against. So some people will say that this stop and search power discriminates on young people because the police use it on young people, but then the biggest proportion of drug users are in these younger age groups. So it's quite hard on an individual level for something like stop and search for an individual to claim that they've been discriminated against if they're black or if they're young. So it's a very difficult thing to argue. And the last right that we're going to talk about is the right to a fair trial and to proportionate sentencing. So these are all things which, again, are embedded in law. So there are clear standards which relate to law enforcement as well as to sentencing. And so violations could be receiving disproportionate sentences or long minimum sentences, which are also disproportionate to the crime that has been committed. So I can use some examples from the United States. There have been some cases where if you do not plead guilty straight away, you could receive a sentence which was 3 times as long that should have been applied for that crime. So in cases where the evidence is not so strong, people actually may forgo a trial and plead guilty, perhaps if they're not guilty, because they're concerned that they may get a sentence that's 3 times as long. So this can impede a fair trial, you could argue. And in terms of proportionate sentencing, things like minimum sentences, for example, there are examples of people receiving 4 years in prison for possession of cannabis. You could argue that this is very disproportionate to the crime that was committed. And we are quite interested in our network in models such as alternative incarceration. So you might have heard the presentation from Elisa Rubini on San Patrignano, where they offer alternative incarceration. So this is for people who've committed other crimes, not because of their drug possession, but they may have committed like burglaries and other non-violent crime which is related to their drug use. And they can then opt instead, under Italian law, to go to a rehabilitation centre for sentences up to 3 years in prison. So from this work, what we've developed is quite a substantial series of recommendations today. I've really only given you a summary of the work that we've conducted. Recommendations, for example, to support funding to the UN ODC for the monitoring of human rights violations, for drug policies to reflect the international rights of children to be protected from drug use. And we've made quite a lot. So we will make these available to you in the paper that we've prepared for the symposium, which will be printed after the conference. But I just want to end on what I think are quite crucial points, is that the international drug policy is very much wounded by episodic in some countries and sparse, but also some very severe human rights violations. But that these violations are not prescribed, condoned, or encouraged by the International Drug Control Conventions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faye, and you were excellent in keeping your time, so I will allow 1 or 2 questions to Faye. Okay. Well, you can always save your questions for later afterwards somewhere. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Marie Roger. Yes, and you are Senior Research and Communications Officer at the International Drug Policy Consortium. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for staying after such a long day. So let me see if I can make this work. Okay, so first I would like to thank the Turkish Green Crescent Society for their kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to start the presentation just introducing what my organization is doing. So we're called the International Drug Policy Consortium, or IDPC. And we're a global network of 118 non-governmental organizations from all around the world. The Turkish Green Crescent Society is also a member of IDPC. And what we try to do is to come together to try to promote an objective and open debate on drug policy. And the policies that we promote are policies that are based on health, on human rights, on development, on social inclusion, and on civil society participation. And one of the key objectives of IDPC is to build the capacity of NGOs to engage in drug policy debates and to share their experience with policymakers. So going straight to my presentation, we've talked a lot about harm reduction over the past 2 days, at least, mention it here and there, but what I'm going to try to do here is try to define what harm reduction actually is. So just the premise of our drug control policies, our global drug control system is about 100 years old now, and the way governments have tackled drugs so far was to traditionally put together a war on drugs approach. So that's to say that governments have implemented tough drug laws and threatened people with severe punishment to deter them from getting involved in the drugs trade. And the objective of that was to try to achieve a drug-free world. About 100 years later now, we have seen the results of such a policy. And what we have seen is that there has actually been no significant reduction in the global drug the global drug market, and there has been no significant impact on the prevalence of drug use. We've heard yesterday a few presentations on Turkey where they were acknowledging that in Turkey, drug use was actually on the increase. What is actually even more concerning, well, so you can see at the international level, actually, there's the same kind of acknowledgement. So this is just a quote from the World Drug Report of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So that was in 2012, and UNODC said there may be some 65 million additional drug users by 2050. So we're nowhere near achieving a drug-free world. The issue with our drug control system is that in addition to that, it's actually led to severe negative consequences. One of which is the rise in powerful organized crime, which has also been associated with the increase in violence and corruption. There's also been a mass incarceration of people caught in the drugs trade. And what we have seen actually is that the people who are incarcerated are not the high-level drug traffickers. They're actually very often people caught for possession for personal use or drug users. So that's highly problematic. There's also been significant human rights violations. Faye has touched upon these, so I'm not going to go deep into this issue. Here I'm going to focus on the health issues. So the global drug control system and the war on drugs approach has actually been associated with significant health issues. So around the world, according to the United Nations, there's 12.7 million people who inject drugs worldwide. Among these, about 10% of them, so that's 1.7 million people who inject drugs, live with HIV. And as Peter Sarosi said in his presentation just before this one, this means that 1/3 of new HIV infections are caused by injecting drug use. So this is outside of Sub-Saharan Africa, but this is still a significant amount of HIV infections that are caused by drug use. And additional information submitted by the UN is that more than 50% of people who inject drugs live with hepatitis C. So according to this data, it's about 6 million people who inject drugs. And in terms of overdoses, these are the primary contributor of the global drug-related deaths. So this is what harm reduction is trying to do, actually, trying to reduce these significant health issues related to drug use. So harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aim primarily at tackling the adverse health consequences related to drug use. And so the objective of harm reduction is to reset the objectives of our drug policies. We're no longer trying to just achieve a drug-free world. This is not the key priority anymore. The key priority is to tackle the health, social, and economic consequences associated with it. So at the premise of harm reduction is the acceptance that there will be some level of drug use in our society. It's the acceptance that some people may be unwilling or unable to stop using drugs. And something that has been a bit lost in this conference so far, and I would like to highlight here, is that according to the United Nations around the world, there's only about 1/10 of people who use drugs who actually have a drug dependence issue. So that's something we need to keep in mind when we put together services to treat people who use drugs. We really need to make sure that the treatment services that we put together reach people who are actually dependent. And these are only 10% of all the people who use drugs. In terms of harm reduction, we're actually tackling every single person who uses drugs. We're trying to reach people where they are at. So if they need to keep using drugs, then we need to make sure that we put together services that save their lives. And actually, harm reduction is also based on the premise and on the realization that most of the harms that are associated with drug use are actually easily preventable, with services that reach people and that benefit them, but they also benefit not only people who use drugs, they benefit their families and also benefit the community. And I'll get back on this when I talk about a few key harm reduction services. Harm reduction targets risks. So it means that every single country will need to evaluate what are the key risks that are associated with drug use and how best to tackle them. Harm reduction also evolves over time. Patterns of drug use evolve, and harm reduction will need to respond to new patterns of use. And also, because patterns of drug use differ from country to country, from region to region, then harm reduction might be slightly different from one country to another. But the premise is the same. Harm reduction is also adapted to the specific needs of some key vulnerable groups. And these include, for example, women. These include children. Faye has already touched on this. Children are particularly vulnerable from certain risks, so we need to make sure the harm reduction services reach them and are adapted to their needs. And something that's very important to remember is that harm reduction started about 40 years ago. So we have a tremendous amount of evidence and experience on what works best in terms of harm reduction. And it's also cost effective, something I'll get back to a bit later. So the United Nations has developed a comprehensive package of harm reduction interventions, which are available here. These have already been slightly touched upon this morning with the World Health Organization presentation on prisons and health. So I won't go into too much detail, but I would like to focus on two of these interventions. And also just to say that these interventions are not, they are comprehensive package, but there's a lot of other harm reduction interventions that you can fit into harm reduction. So these are not exhaustive, this list. What's also important to note on this comprehensive package is that they are sorted in order of priority. So the United Nations actually declared that needle and syringe programs and opioid substitution treatment are very, very high importance harm reduction interventions. So that's why I'm focusing on those here. So first, needle and syringe programs. So this comes from the fact that sharing injecting equipment is associated with a very high risk of transmission of blood-borne diseases, including HIV and hepatitis B and C. So some service providers all around the world have started distributing sterile injecting equipment. So we are going from here, a situation where there are discarded needles, needles are shared among people who use drugs, they put themselves at significant risks, and also engage in a place where they can talk to healthcare and social workers to talk about their drug use, to talk about the risks associated with their drug use, and potentially talk about integrating a treatment system. And in terms of protecting the community, it's also a way to dispose safely of dirty needles to make sure that they don't pose a problem on people who use drugs, but also on the rest of the community. As you can see from this figure, which is drawn from the Global State of Harm Reduction, 86 countries around the world have now adopted needle and syringe programs. So we're talking about a significant amount of countries around the world, in a lot of regions around the world actually, that have adopted needle syringe programs, both in the communities and in some countries also in prisons. We've heard this morning from the WHO presentation that these are very important to adopt also in prisons. So just to show you this slide. Right, so now turning to opioid substitution treatment. So this intervention is to try to substitute heroin use with substances such as methadone and buprenorphine as part of a treatment for people dependent on heroin. Because these substances are orally taken, this significantly reduces the risks of injection and of needle sharing, and then of associated risks. So the evidence shows all around the world that this has drastically improved the general health conditions of people who use drugs. It's also reduced lethal overdoses. And it's actually reduced criminal activity because people no longer need to commit petty crimes to access their heroin. They're actually in a treatment program where they can access safe medication that enables them to reduce their criminal activities as well. And in some locations, it's actually reduced engagement in sex work. So in terms of social inclusion, it's been shown that opioid substitution treatment also has a significant impact on the social inclusion of people who become much more stable, they can retain a job, they can have a very productive life. And I would like to talk to you a bit about cost effectiveness. So there's a tremendous amount of studies that show that opioid substitution treatment is an extremely cost-effective intervention. I just wanted to mention one that's from a study from the UNODC, UNAIDS, and World Health Organization that concludes, and I quote, "According to several conservative estimates, every dollar invested in opioid dependence treatment programs may yield a return of between $4 and $7 in reduced drug-related crime, criminal justice cost, and theft alone. And when savings related to healthcare are included, total savings can exceed costs by a ratio of 12 to 1. So we're talking about significant savings in terms of costs for the government. And here again, there's about 77 countries around the world that have adopted opioid substitution treatment. So with regard to the evidence, and I'm going to go quickly on these slides have been developed by an organization called the Global Commission on Drug Policy. This commission was formed in 2011 by a group of high-level policymakers. So they're former heads of states, presidents, prime ministers, headed by Cardoso, who is the former president of Brazil. And the Global Commission came out with a report called War on Drugs, and they have submitted these specific graphs on the evidence on effectiveness of harm reduction interventions. So on this first graph, you can see the percentage of HIV prevalence among people who inject drugs in countries that have adopted harm reduction interventions from a very early on. And you can see that the prevalence of HIV among these people is rather low. It's below 5% in all these countries. In the second graph, you can see a similar graph, but for countries that have included harm reduction interventions only partially in their countries or a bit later on in the progress of the epidemic. And there you can see that the prevalence of HIV among people who inject drugs is slightly higher. We can say significantly higher, between 10 and 16%. But then you can see, if the graph shows, on the last graph, countries that have continuously resisted large-scale harm reduction interventions. And there you can see a significant proportion of people who inject drugs being infected by HIV that reaches about 43% in Thailand. Something that has been touched upon yesterday by one of the plenary presentations in the morning was the problems of political and legislative barriers to harm reduction. I also wanted to mention the funding issue on harm reduction that's been very well presented by Peter Sorosi just before me. So I'm just going to focus on these barriers here. All around the world, there's a significant issue of policies and practices that go against the access to harm reduction. So, for example, that can include the criminalization of possession of a syringe. This obviously is very difficult for a person who uses drugs to go to a needle and syringe exchange program and then get arrested by the police upon really, exit of the center because they are in possession of a syringe. Another problem can be the criminalization of people who use drugs. So in about 21 jurisdictions around the world, these jurisdictions have actually removed criminal sanctions against people who use drugs. This means that drug use remains illegal, but instead of sending the person to prison, they are actually referred to healthcare services or they are imposed an administrative sanction. So it's no longer a criminal record, it's no longer a prison sentence. And this has been quite efficient in reducing the barriers to accessing harm reduction and treatment interventions. And to finish, and I'm going to go quickly, I wanted to present you with the case of Portugal, which has actually decriminalized drug use in 2001. So now when a person is stopped by the police in possession of a drug, they are no longer referred to the criminal justice system. They are referred to an administrative body that is composed of a psychologist, a social worker, and a doctor. And they review on a case-by-case basis the person's case, and they refer them to the health and social services that they would need. This intervention has been accompanied by an incredible scale-up of harm reduction interventions. And about 13 years later now, it's easy to see the results. First of all, and something really important, is that there has been no increase in drug use in Portugal. So that's quite important to note. And in terms of health and social outcomes, it's been very positive. And I'm going to go very quickly because I know I'm over time. So there has been a significant increase in overdose deaths and in new HIV cases among people who inject drugs. There has also been no increase in drug-related crimes. And it's actually been quite interesting for law enforcement officers who can now stop focusing their interventions on people who use drugs. They can actually focus on important, violent, high-level crime. So that's actually been quite productive in terms of law enforcement actions. And also, there has been an increase in people accessing drug dependence treatment. So harm reduction really is a way to help people out, both in terms of protecting their health, but also as a bridge towards treatment. And finally, there has been a good improvement in social inclusion with more people accessing employment and housing and a reduction in stigmatization of people who use drugs. So I'm going to stop here. I've put a few key references here for you, for those who are interested. And if you'd like to learn more, please don't hesitate to ask me questions here or just send me an email. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much, Marie. And I leave the floor open for a little while at least. Yes, please. Microphone there.
Yes, my name is Maria Renström and I'm working at WHO. So that's why I need to just make a very small clarification that the recommendation that was shown with the needle exchange as number 1 is the recommendation on HIV prevention. So it's not on drug policy at all. And I think it's important to make that difference so that because WHO hasn't any recommendation related to drug policy on that issue. But on HIV prevention, yes. I just wanted to make it clear.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we have another question.
Evet, sunumu yapan Mrs. Maria teşekkürlerimizi arz ediyoruz. Yeşilay'ın davetine uyup geldiği için ben de bir Yeşilay mensubu olarak kendilerine teşekkür ediyorum buraya geldikleri için. Şimdi uyuşturucunun biraz önce söylediler, satıcılardan çok kullanıcıların tutuklandıklarını, hapse atıldıklarından bahsettiler. Burada acaba bunu üreten ve satanlar kullanıyor mu? Bunlarla ilgili bir çalışma olmuyor mu? Ya da kolluk kuvvetleri bunlara göz mü yumuyor? Sadece kullananlar mı cezalandırılıyor? Bir başka soru da yani burada birçok şeyden bahsedildi. Ben 2 gündür bu sunumlara katılıyorum. Birçok konuşmacı, birçok tedbirlerden bahsettiler. Dünkü konuşmamda da söyledim. İnanç faktörü bunlarda neden işlenmiyor? Bence bütün dinler buna aynı şekilde bakıyor. Hiçbir din uyuşturucunun müspet yönünü, doğru yönünü bahsetmeyecektir. Neden bu faktörler uyuşturucu kullanımında ön plana çıkarılmıyor, öne alınmıyor? Çünkü kullanmadan önce bir tedbir almanız lazım ki o kullanımı önleyesiniz. Bence inancın bunda çok daha büyük etkin bir rol oynayacağına inanıyorum. Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Sağ olun.
Okay, so it's a lot of questions. So the first one, I'm just saying that, so in many countries the problem is that some laws don't make any distinction between possession for personal use and possession for dealing or trafficking. So that's why a lot of people who are arrested in the streets are actually users and not dealers. So obviously dealers are arrested, producers can be arrested too. Some producers use drugs, some dealers use drugs too. But the reality is that the law enforcement interventions around the world tend to focus on the little fish in the street and not on the big traffickers, because it's much easier to show progress when you arrest those that are most visible. And those that are most visible are usually the drug users or the little dealers. So that's the first question, and I hope I've responded to this. For the second one, actually there's a lot, just to go back to prevention, harm reduction. Obviously, yes, I'm not against prevention, and there's a lot of good examples of prevention that have been presented at this conference, and I'm glad that I learned more about them as well. The issue is, despite prevention, there is some drug use, and we need to make sure that we tackle the harms associated with this drug use. So that's where harm reduction comes in hand. We're not going against prevention at all. In terms of religion, there's actually some very good examples that have been presented yesterday. I don't know if you went to the session on religion and drug prevention, harm reduction, etc. There was a specifically interesting presentation that I went to on the provision of methadone maintenance treatment in a mosque in Malaysia. So that's one of the ways where you can engage people who use drugs that are from a religious community to go to treatment and to harm reduction harm reduction interventions. So I would like to refer you to this. In Iran as well, they have worked a lot around Islam and harm reduction. So if you want, I can send you some documentation on that, and we could talk about it a bit further. I know we're a bit short on time.
Okay, thank you. I'll let one more question. Yeah.
It's Rowdy Yates from Scotland. I just wanted to point out very quickly that there is an omission in your definition of harm reduction, in that one of the things I think we forget at our peril is that harm reduction is actually two quite distinct elements. Firstly, it's reducing the harm that drug users may or may not do to themselves. And secondly, it's reducing the harm that they may do to the rest of society. Now, it seems to me, speaking from drug treatment, that an interest in reducing the harm that drug users do to themselves is absolutely legitimate. That's part of our business as people involved in drug treatment. But being involved in reducing the harm that they do to the rest of society does not necessarily seem to me to be part of our business. And I'll give you an example here. We know from the research that around 80% of people presenting to drug treatment in Western European countries for the first time want to become drug-free. We also know that 95% of people presenting to drug treatment end up with a methadone prescription. So we're clearly not meeting their aspirations, and I would argue that that's because we're putting the ideology of reducing the harm to society before their aspirations.
Right, thanks for this comment. I think that, the principle of harm reduction is centered on the individual. So you want to meet the individual where he is, he or she. In terms of reducing the harm to community, it's actually been one of the results of some harm reduction interventions. The needle and syringe programs have a direct impact on community harms because it reduces the number of needles that have been discarded in the streets. So that's how that's one of the reasons why we say that harm reduction can actually have a role in reducing harms in the communities. In terms of your question around recovery and abstinence-based versus opioid substitution treatment, we don't go against abstinence-based treatment, absolutely not. What we try to promote is a menu of services from which people can choose depending on their needs and wants. So if a person wants to access abstinence-based treatment, they should be able to do it. If they want to access opioid substitution treatment, then they should have the option to do it. So I hope this responds to your query, comment, or concerns.
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there for time reasons. Now, the next speaker is actually a whole team. So I let Ms. Therese Holmqvist introduce the next subject here, the Three Cities Project.
Thank you. And actually, I'm welcomed by a colleague of mine because we are a whole theme here today. To tell you a little bit more about the Three Cities Project. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants and organizers, thank you for really interesting and good days. It's a pleasure being here, and it's really, really important for us working in these areas and fields, getting the chance, getting together, share experiences. So thank you very much. We, a team from Sweden, will make a presentation about our project, the Three Cities Project. This is quite a practical angle about work done in 3 cities in Sweden. We like working as a team in the 3 cities, so you will see us as a team at the stage as well. We will talk, all 3 of us. So here today, our team from Sweden. First, maybe you can wave. Here is Kerstin. Kerstin is the head of a treatment unit in the city of Gothenburg. There you can see me, Therese Holmqvist. I'm a project manager in the city of Stockholm. Our chair today and also colleague in this project, Mr. Anders Eriksson, is also project manager in Stockholm. Unfortunately, we are missing Ulf Ljungberg today. He is a prevention manager in the city of Malmö and couldn't be here. We will do our very best to fill in the Malmö experiences and Ulf experiences in this presentation.
So now for a little while, I am Mr. Ljungberg from Malmö. Well, the Three Cities Project, in short, what is that? Well, we come from Sweden, and we are a relatively small country in the north of Europe. And as you see, there are the 3 cities of Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö who are uniting in this work. And just a few words about our cities. If you look at our cities and our neighboring counties, we represent actually around half of the population in Sweden, because Sweden is big in that sense, but it's not very densely populated in the north. So we look a bit southern oriented here, but what we do or don't do has an effect on a great deal of people. And the purpose of the Three Cities Project is, of course, to develop quality in prevention and to decrease the cannabis consumption among young people. I mean, we have been doing prevention for many years, decades even, and we could have, of course, have continued as we always did, but we said we want to improve our work, we want to do better. We are not satisfied with what is now, so we want to unite our forces and extend the work a bit. It's a project that runs for 3 years. And as you know, 3 years is a very short time to do something if you have 3 big cities, because big cities have their own conditions. For instance, we have a big drug market than the rest of the Sweden, but we also have, in some instances, bigger resources. So the situation in our cities is a bit specific. But it takes time, and therefore, of course, we hope to continue this work after the 3 years. More time is needed, actually. We are funded by the Minister of Social Affairs in the framework of the National ANDT strategy, and that stands for Alcohol, Narcotic Drugs, Doping, and Tobacco. So we have a cohesive strategy for those issues, and we are very happy to get this funding to be able to do this work as we do. We work on 3 levels, and we'll come into more detail, or at least we'll show you a framework for what we are doing. But we think it's important that we are not just working on one level as a cities. We need the prevention to discourage cannabis use in the first place, but also we need the levels of early intervention and treatment, and you will get some examples of that later on in the presentation. You can look at the 3 Cities project as a sort of umbrella, because within this framework we have 14 sub-projects, and that's what we're going to show you in a little while. And it's important because we know from prevention science that you have to do a lot of things. You cannot do just one thing in one city and hope that that will be effective prevention. So many things are needed at the same time on the different levels. We tend to describe what we are doing, if I can, in the following way. You have to understand that what we are doing is, of course, in a Swedish context. And I think that's an important aspect of prevention, that you actually look at your own country or your own city to see what kind of laws do we have, what kind of conditions do we have, what kind of resources do we have, and what kind of problem do we have. So understand what we are saying from a Swedish context, and maybe we can get back to that as well. We look upon this as a puzzle, because prevention is a puzzle, and many parts have to be in place. And first of all, what we want to do is, of course, to base our interventions on science. We want to learn as much as possible what is effective and what isn't. And I'll make a comment in a little while. Also, and this is also very important to stress, that prevention to a great extent is mobilization. Prevention cannot be done by 1 or 2 civil servants. It has to be, the society as a whole has to be engaged to a great extent to get this working. It's also important with political anchoring, because we can, of course, work very, very hard, but without the sanction of the politicians, the ones who decide, who make policies and make resources available, it will be very hard. So we have cared a lot about the political anchoring, what we are doing. And we also need, when we are doing all these interventions, you need some kind of structure for steering. And it's not always easy to make 3 cities cooperate and unite on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and when you're going to do it. So we have put a lot of emphasis in this common structure for steering. And of course, a structure for research, because we want to be looked at. We want to have this live discussion with researchers, because I've been project lead for quite a few years, and I could be going and doing projects, but I want the dialogue with the researchers to improve my work. And I think all of us in this project have an eagerness to be better at what we are doing. And of course, we have to have this structure for our sub-projects. Who is going to do what and in what order? And it is quite a job to organize, as I said, 3 big cities. But we think it's worth it because you get the united resources from 3 big cities. And that is very, very important. So, a few comments more on this. And as I said, and we'll come back to this, we work on the 3 levels here. But a few comments first on that, and dissemination and documentation we will end with. We said this is about prevention and communication sciences. There are so many theories and so many baselines for work, and I just want to mention a few. We, of course, use the knowledge on risk and protective factors. We know that it's important to try to reduce risk factors as well as improving, enhancing the protective factors among young people. And having said that, if you look in the middle, it says prevention and promotion. So we are doing both prevention, that is looking at the problem in this case, the cannabis, and of course, what can we do to promote the good side for the kids so they're also supported. It has to be a balance with both prevention and promotion in this. And I'll leave the next slide to you, Therese, about political anchoring.
Political anchoring is, of course, of great importance for a project like this. And actually, top politicians in our 3 cities champion the 3 cities project. That has been really, really helpful and important, of course. In some instances, politicians have enhanced extra resources to make it possible to do regular, long-time prevention work as well. In Sweden, we also have a quite strong political consensus when it comes to drug policy, which is also very helpful for a practitioner in the field. When it comes to prevention, I would say that mobilization is important. I would almost say that it's mobilization is prevention, because nothing will be done if there's not a cooperation between many actors working together. So mobilization has been really important in our project. Of course, youths are the center of this work. Youths are our good reasons for doing this, of course. Youths contributed to this project in many ways. For example, we had some really interesting results from focus group studies with youth that we got a lot of ideas about how youth felt about cannabis and what that has to be done and what kind of support and so on they had. And we also got a lot of information about their attitudes. This information helped us to shape the efforts in this project. Parents are, of course, really important to us as well in this project. Parents are involved in many activities and efforts in this project in all 3 cities and in all levels of the work we do as well. We will tell you a little bit more about this later. Parents are the most important persons to a young person, and parents have contributed as well in designing the efforts through focus groups as well. Other important actors work together in this project, making sure that efforts are gaining impact.
Thank you. As we said, as you remember from the puzzle, It is a bit of organization to run a three-city project, but as I said, I think it's worthwhile, so I recommend it if you have cities that you are working with to develop it. Because we have this sort of matrix for how we organize our. So we have an overall steering group, and they have been working really well and have managed to unite on all major decisions. And we, of course, are connected to the Minister of Social Affairs when it comes to decision-making here. We have an overall research group consisting of 6 researchers, 2 from each city, who will produce a final report when it is done. And we have an overall work group who are coordinating the practical work and helping each other out. So we have this overall steering system, but we also have the same functioning on our local level. And as I said, it's a recommendation if you can, because we have gained so much, and I could talk very long about the benefits of being more than one city. But it's not time for that now. We'll continue, and we would like to show you, this is the matrix for our 14 sub-projects. And as you see on the sort of green level there, that's what we call primary prevention, the second level, early intervention, and the red level, what we call care and treatment. And as you see, all cities are doing something in all of these squares and making the puzzle complete. And as you also can notice, in some sub-projects, all 3 cities are engaged. In some projects, 2 cities are, and in some projects, just 1 city. And that is because we are trying to also save resources. Everybody cannot do everything all the time. So this is also a matrix for learning from each other. So if Malmö or Gothenburg does something, Stockholm benefits because we have a close contact with our colleagues. And of course, when we are doing all 3 in it, we get this, as I said, collective strength of us all. We will pick out just a few examples from this matrix. We do not have the time to show you all 14 sub-projects, so we'll just give you a very short glimpse. And the first one we'll just mention here is the European Drug Prevention Quality Standards, which has been so far carried by Stockholm and Malmö. And I don't know if you're familiar with the EDPQS. This is sort of their work model. And if you're interested in EDPQS, and I surely recommend you, go to and listen to Angelina Brotherhood tomorrow afternoon. She's telling you more about the EDPQS and EQUS in the seminar. But mainly, this is a process tool for improving quality, because within all these different squares, you have quality questions that help you as a project leader to do a better work. And we are doing this for the long time run to make ourselves more professional and the ones who are carrying out professional prevention work in Sweden. Yes, and having said that, for the green level, which is prevention, we will have a quick example from the yellow level.
Thank you. The yellow level that Anders mentioned to you is about early intervention. And early intervention sub-projects are, as my colleague mentioned, going on in all 3 cities. All the 3 cities have in some way in this level focused on the competence development among professionals and also cooperation towards risk groups. And I will give you a short glimpse of one of our sub-projects called Moomin. Anyone heard of Moomin before? Wait? Oh, it's all fresh. I will tell you a little bit more. The 3 Cities project is supporting this ongoing function in the city of Stockholm. Of course, in Malmö and in Gothenburg, police and social services are working together in this field as well. But this is a specific example of a cooperation project. This is a collaboration between social service in the field and the police authorities in Stockholm. This project aims to motivate and immediately offer the youth and his/her family counseling or treatment. And the aim is as well to channel to local services. And as I said, this is an ongoing project that has been run a couple of years, and what the three cities projects have done here is made it possible to do evaluation and dissemination. And we are very much looking forward to, in the end of this year, receiving the reports from the researchers that will learn us more about the effects of this sub-project. Kerstin?
Hello, everyone. I have the honor to be the last one to speak here today, and I think we are a little bit tired, all of us, but I hope I will catch your interest for the last moment here. I will talk to you a little bit about care and treatment level in the Three Cities project, and I will give you a short glimpse of some of the projects that have been made under this level. We have something that is called ungdok and adolescent substance abuse. What's ungdok? You can, ung is the same word as young in English. So it's a documentation system for the young persons coming to our treatment clinics in Gothenburg, Malmö, and Stockholm. And the treatment clinics name, we call them Maria clinics. And they are very much the same sort of clinics. And we are meeting young persons from the age of 13 up to 21. And those persons are in an early statement of drug abuse most of the time. And we, of course, because of the young person, the age of those persons, we also work very much with the families and the parenting. This documentation system has been developed, and the purpose of that is to collect information and knowledge about the target group. And of course, mapping and investigate how the young person's situation is when they are coming to our clinic. It's based on evidence and clinical aspects, and it's an interview form at admission, discharge, and follow-up. And shortly here, the admission contains 12 assessment areas. An example is socio-demographic information, treatment, contact, housing and supply, employment, alcohol, drug and tobacco, and so on. And the discharge and follow-up contains 7 assessment areas. And these interviews are made with those young persons that are seeking help in our clinics. And this is a model we have developed under this Three Cities project. And the model for the clinic is developed by the employees from the Three Cities. And it's led by researchers. And the focus on the developed follow-up purpose is to analyze the results and see, for example, what treatment interventions led to recovering from drug abuse. And of course, improve and develop our treatment methods overall. Which persons are dropping out is also very important information for us. And we hope that through this analysis by this documentation system, we can be better off with our young persons. We also have a part called Ungdok and Trend and Tendencies. And that's the purpose of that project is to create a model for identifying and tracking trends of adolescents' drug use and psychosocial situation in the 3 major cities. And the project group has worked with 14 indicators based on the developed Ungdok. And we now have a base facts for this first year. And this project will be more interesting when the years go on, and we now have some sort of base figures. And for the long term, we have an interesting project here, I think. That is one of the projects under care and treatment. And I will talk a little bit more about this level. And I come over to this point, communication with target groups. We have, under this part of Three Cities project, developed a website for getting in contact and increase communication with the target group. The website is created with and adapted for adolescents in text and image. This page contains a contact form, and this is really important because this contact form makes it very easy for a person to get in contact with our clinic. They just have to write a phone number or a mail address, and we take contact. And this contact form has already made several of contacts into our clinic, so we are very pleased with that. The website is also linked to social media. And of course, this is to increase contact with the young people and have their voices into our treatment clinics. We also have some self-help groups, both for parents and for young substance abuser, and for relatives and adult substance abuser. In the spring of 2014, we started, the group was started for relatives and parents, and they can meet others in the same situations, share experiences, and find ways to improve their own situation. The contents of these 8 sessions are based on the wishes and the needs that the participants have. We also have 2 treatment studies going on. One treatment study is for adults, and it's a treatment study of hazardous use, abuse, and dependence on cannabis, users and therapists' perspectives and change processes. And the purpose of this study is to describe and evaluate the work being done at the clinics and to spread knowledge about treatment. A part of the study, as a part of the study, there were interviews done with people that use cannabis frequently and has cannabis as the primary drug. Even the relatives of those who seek help and the therapist has been interviewed. We also have a treatment study for younger persons called Girls and Cannabis. And this is a qualitative study of 11 young girls that have left cannabis abuse. And the purpose of the study is to examine how the use of cannabis during adolescence is affecting young girls' lives and social relationships. The context will be that the growing adolescence is in will be examined with a focus on why they stopped, how they experienced the help they got from society, how it is being a girl, female in this environment, what the turning point is, what happened when you go into adulthood and more orderly life, if this have some impact on your desire to stop smoke cannabis frequently. These are a little glimpse from those projects under care and treatment, and there also says a little line about special activities going on in Gothenburg, and I will just shortly mention this activities. This is a part of Gothenburg and it's politically anchored in the district, and this contains several activities made in this specific area. And this cannabis information sent home to all custodians in the district with children aged 10 to 17 years with information of cannabis. Training in cannabis knowledge for over 1,000 employees in the municipality part, social service, schools, student health care, healthcare centers, and NGOs in the area. This is in collaboration with the police, and they have started some dialogue cafes, and there are parent meetings at school on cannabis theme, and cooperation with 12 taverns in the area in the project Taverns Against Narcotics. This is supported by the Tree City project. Of course, as you understand, there's a lot of things going on in our three cities. And those projects, they are documented. And in the end of this year or start of the next year, there will be a dissemination from the researchers that are involved in those projects. So you are very welcome to contact us here, our mail addresses, because there are a lot of details that we can't go into here. But if you have more questions to ask, please be welcome to send us a mail. And with these words, I would like to thank you very much for keeping up your interest, and I hope you will take an opportunity to start a similar project home with you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is late, but I see hands here, so please, a few questions, yes. Yes?
Sunumunuz için ve uzaklardan geldiğiniz için teşekkür ediyorum. Belki kaçırmış olabilirim, kaçırdıysam eğer özür dilerim. 3 şehir seçilmesini ya da o 3 şehrin seçilmesinin bir anlamı var. 3 şehrin bir özelliği var mı? Birbiriyle ilişki anlamda ya da yaptığınız bir çalışma var mı? Ön çalışma diye sorayım. Teşekkür ederim.
Well, the answer is simple. These are the 3 biggest cities in Sweden, and we have a traditional cooperation, and we wanted to make this cooperation more intense. So we wanted to do this, and therefore we proposed this 3-city project. So it was ourselves who took the initiative about wanting to do this. Yes, more, I think.
Efendim, adım Abdullah Yılmaz, İstanbul Üniversitesi Sosyal Hizmet 2. sınıf öğrencisiyim. Sayın Meri Hanım'a şu soruyu sormak istiyorum. Şimdi medyanın bazı düşünceleri empoze etmede ne kadar önemli olduğunu biliyoruz. Bilinçaltı yöntemlerle, özellikle mesela Hollywood filmlerinde buna çokça rastlıyoruz. Yani bilinçaltı yöntemlerle, bazı tekniklerle bir düşünce, bir efendime söyleyeyim marka çok rahat bir şekilde insanlara kabul ettirilebiliyor. Acaba sosyal hizmet alanında, bu alanda da bilinçaltı yöntemlerle, medya kullanılarak, film sökleri kullanılarak madde bağımlılığının azaltılmasıyla alakalı çalışma yapılabilir mi? Sizin ülkenizde bu tarz çalışmalar yapılıyor mu? Teşekkür ederim.
I'm not sure. We are not doing that in the social services now. Maybe it could be an idea that to talk about that and develop for the future, because we know that communication media is important, as you say and point out, but the social services has not a very long tradition on communication in that sense. So we are learning, actually, as we go along. And the example showed here is a few steps further communicating with new media to reach the target group we want to do. So we'll take that with us. Yeah. One more, please. Please.
Ülkemize hoş geldiniz. Bu güzel sunumunuz için hepinize çok çok teşekkür ediyorum. Benim bir kafama takılan bir soru var. Avrupa'nın bazı ülkelerinde maddeler eroin gibi, esrar gibi serbestçe satılıyor. Mesela bunlardan bir tanesi Hollanda. Bu konuda düşüncenizi öğrenmek istiyorum. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Well, I will not go into detail and comment other countries, actually. And that's what I say. We have, whatever we do must be looked upon from the context of each country. So you should talk to them. But of course, we try to do our best in our country to limit the access to cannabis for young people. So yeah. You want to comment more on that? So. Okay, one more comment. Okay.
Yeah, it was not actually related to the Three Cities project, but I know from people working in tobacco, it was on the issue of using the sort of features in movies and so on, because we know that in the tobacco field, they normally, product placement is called. So they sort of promote their brands by product placement in films and so on. And I know they've done some research on that on tobacco, but not within this project at all. I know it because from my experience at WHO and so on. But it's actually been done, and I know that they also consider whether they can use the same methods. So social marketing is the term when they try to use the same methods as they do when they promote something, brands, for example, and do it in the opposite way. So you understand? So it's called social marketing in English. And there are some experiences, but not within this project.
Thank you. We have one question. That will be the final question, I think.
First of all, hello to everyone. I'm from North Cyprus, from DATPA, from Drug Alcohol Prevention Association member. As I know, there are many suicides in Sweden in general when I look at the graphs. Can we relate these suicides with drug usage, or I have this question in my mind that you have many drug usage, we have seen it on your presentation as well. Can we relate this?
I'm not sure I understand the question, actually.
The question is, there's this very high suicide rates in Sweden, people killing each other, themselves. Can we relate these rates with drug usage?
I'll let Maria answer that.
I recommend you to read the latest publication from WHO on actually where the suicide rates are the highest. It's actually in India and other countries. So they're totally...
No. I'm talking about Europe, not Asia, not also, the whole world.
Yeah. No, but I wanted you to, if you're interested in the suicide rates, you should go to WHO latest publication with the latest data on suicidal rates. And it's actually not at all what you're saying, but better you can look into that, because I think you can find quite interesting also from Europe when it comes to suicide rate. The latest data from WHO collected from all member states of WHO. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I got the answer, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And by that, I would like to thank you all for staying this late, and to all the speakers. Thank you very much for today.